kind of ran out of time just as we're getting into some very interesting topics. I really like to avoid that this time, and I'm trying to leave enough room at the end for more Q&A, and we'll take a break after the deceptive software section for questions on that, and then we'll move into phishing. So, Windows privacy is now in SBTU, in the Security Business Unit. The reason we decided to move the group is, quite frankly, there wasn't that much synergy between privacy and the IE team where privacy was hosted. There's a lot more synergy with the security team. I think you'll recognize that the teams share a number of similar strategies and general processes for getting the right things to happen during software development. So if we actually work together on stuff, it's possible that we could reduce the tax on developers. Instead of there being 2 sessions for training, one for security, one for privacy, maybe there's a day training on trust, and privacy is an extra 30% on the back end of the security work. So I think our goal is to integrate privacy into the security development lifecycle process, the SDL process. The other benefit we get is there are some projects that really transcend between privacy and security. You really can't put your finger directly on it. Deceptive software and phishing are 2 great examples. So by working in one group, we can tap the combined expertise and come up with hopefully better solutions to these problems because we're all talking about it at the same time. I could already tell you, since I've been there since June, this has actually happened. I'm really enjoying the time I'm spending with the security team. They have a wealth of knowledge. I get to sort of make them privacy aware at the same time, so it's very satisfying. It's a great move. Structurally, the organization is more or less the same. I have a new person called Jeffrey Eagleston. You might interact with him, you might not. He's coordinating the Windows Privacy Initiative. The existing privacy cabinet that we use heavily in the process is still there, unchanged, along with the 165 privacy leads that we have in Windows. Short term, our focus is, get XPSP2 out the door, and then drive the Longhorn Privacy Basic as we've been doing. Longer term is the actual integration of this privacy work into SDL. That's just a quick update. Now, with respect to XPSP2, I'm happy to report that I have in my hands the final privacy statements for Windows and for IE. And to my knowledge, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think this represents the very first time there's ever been a privacy statement for an operating system. I could be wrong, but I think that's the case. And this was a tremendous amount of work over the last 8, 9, 10 months, tapping that whole WPI process, the 165 privacy leads, doing detailed analysis, distilling these down into disclosures, aggregating this 108-page privacy white paper that we wrote on Phone Home, and distilling it down into a shy 21 pages of information, crossing probably 25 key components that have privacy aspects that people probably want to know about. And every section kind of looks the same. It's pretty easy to read and to look at. When there's detailed information, there's a link. Typically, the sections go something like this: what the feature does, information collected, processed, or transmitted, the use of the information, the choice and control you have over it, and a place for additional information. It's actually in the last slide. There's a link. This is posted on the web right now. So you can look at this at your leisure. But I'm very pleased with this work. It really shows that we were able to create something out of nothing, and I think it's a great move forward for privacy and disclosure and transparency. In terms of what's happening next, not only will these be posted, but of course they'll be localized. We're also setting up a web-based feedback channel. In the past, we used to just put in a link for send your issues to some mail address. And the reality is you get so much spam in these email channels that it's unrealistic to actually even go through it all. So we're moving to a web-based form. And there's this new Microsoft Privacy Response Center work that's being done with Peter's help and MSN's help. That won't be online in time for the XPSP2 rollout. So as a stopgap measure, we're going to launch a very simple set of web pages just to cut down on the spam. And we're also going to do some ad hoc internationalization or translation support for international issues. We'll localize those feedback pages, and then some internal groups within Microsoft and our subsidiaries will do translation of complaints that we might get in. Office has done this ad hoc process for a while. It turns out at the end of the day, after you cut through all the spam, they're only averaging 1 question a month that needs translation. For Windows, that may be higher. We don't know. We'll get there when we see it. If this process doesn't work or scale, we'll have to figure out something else as a stopgap until the MPRC is online. So let's talk about deceptive software. I think the last time we spoke, I actually started to get into this topic. We really didn't get that far. Some of this will be a little bit of review, and then we'll get into the new material, just so everyone's on the same page with respect to where we're at in our thinking. So deceptive software. We think of this not only as spyware, but all its variants, and it includes anything from unauthorized adware through things that hijack your system, either your browser or your host file, you name it, or dialers that do unauthorized use of your resources, like calling out on 900 numbers and charging up phone bills. The common theme when you look at all this stuff, and we were a little distressed by the moniker spyware, because a number of these things don't spy. Like the dialers aren't spying, they're stealing your resources and charging up funds. So the title is not quite right, the name, the label. So we went to a slightly different flavor, which was this concept of deception, because the common thread in all these things is some level of deception where the users are tricked, they're just simply unaware that things are happening. Associated with this software is difficult uninstalls and covert reinstalls that are very sticky. And at the end of the day, it's an emotional issue for people. Essentially, customers are incredibly frustrated. They feel out of control. I know I do when I go to my machine and I can't tell whether I've been compromised or not. I'm getting weird behavior. I'm thinking I must have spyware, and I still can't put my finger on it. And it's really frustrating. Some people's systems become unusable. We've heard anecdotal stories of people throwing machines out the window, out the door, down the hall. It's a very nasty set of circumstances. But I will want to point out again that philosophically, when we look at what's happening, the features underlying this set of circumstances are not in themselves bad. Tracking, when it's done without authorization, is spying. Tracking, when it's done with authorization, can lead to personalization. And Amazon.com has been a great example of people who get book recommendations, and clearly in that context, being tracked and being provided useful information in the context of that system with the appropriate disclosures works fine. So tracking is not the evil thing. It's not the feature. It's the behavior around the feature and the appropriate notice and choice. Other examples are subsidizing the cost of software with adware. Adware should be viewed as a neutral term. Many people don't view it that way, but it really should be viewed neutrally. Unauthorized adware should be viewed negatively. But adware is a key component in a horse trade that most people don't. Sometimes they realize it, sometimes they don't. Clearly, when you watch network TV and you see commercials and you get these free programs off the air, you're getting them because they're subsidized by the advertisements. So you get this free service. Likewise, if you use Hotmail, off to the side, there's an embedded set of advertisements that subsidize the cost of that free mail service. You wouldn't get it unless you paid, it was paid for somehow. To the extent that you understand the horse trade and you made a conscious decision about it, that's the essence of what we're looking for in best practices in terms of what we want to see happen. So for example, I think it's Eudora, I could be wrong, but I think they have two separate SKUs, one with ads, one without, as a mail tool, if I got the name right. And so the user has the choice of whether they want to get, pay less and get ads that might be well behaved because they understand how they work and they can be controlled, or not have ads but pay more. You could buy cable TV and get programming with fewer or almost no commercials. So it's really up to you how you want to deal with this. Again, it's not the feature. And finally, even browser hijacking also there are scenarios that work fine. I mean, I may want a better search page. I may want a better home page that has more services to me and weather and whatnot. That's really up to me. It's not necessarily resetting that's the problem. It's the notice and choice around it. Okay, so these were examples I showed last time. Very quickly we'll go through these just so everybody sees them again. Here's your prototypical normal download experience. You go to a web page that's your favorite one. There's some link on there. Click here for a cool stock ticker. You click it. You get the security warning. And this is circa before XBSP2. And it basically tells you, hey, do you want to install this thing? It's from this publisher. And you get to make that kind of decision if you want. That's the way we originally released this experience. Now, some common tricks. The first one is people overload this name field that's supposed to be just a software name, and they shove an entire miniature EULA in here, which, at the very least, is confusing. You could call it deceptive, but I'd almost say it isn't deceptive. It doesn't quite get that far. But if you read it really carefully, and I'll just read it to you. After accepting our license agreements, Program 1, Program 2, free ad-supported downloads that display 1 useful information, 2 branded ads selected based on websites you view, click here to read our agreements, click yes to accept. There's actually 3 different decisions a user has to make when it's presented this way. The 2 questions inside the EULA plus the 1 button at the bottom, our interface designers would say, this is terrible. This is a horrible experience because there's so many things going on. The user can't quite pull them apart. If you were to read it very carefully, though, they are telling you that this is subsidized software through advertisements. They're not hiding that fact. It's there, right there. And if the user clicks yes, you might construe this as a binding sort of disclosure. Anyway, it's clearly confusing. And I wouldn't recommend doing it. And it certainly wasn't what we intended when we released this dialog. Now, if you actually click into the EULAs and you actually read some of these ridiculous terms that are in there, I'll just read off the highlighted part. It says, blah, 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 install new applications at any time without your knowledge and you agree to the terms of the new applications. Wow, what a great set of terms. That means, as a vendor, I could shove whatever I want on your box and say, yeah, I get a right to call your 900 numbers and, you know, blah, 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 I'm off to the races. All right, this is pretty wild. This goes back to this issue of EULAs and how do you present them to users so users understand the legal terms under which they're accepting software. This EULA was not prominently displayed. It was not, this information wasn't above any kind of fold that you could see. You had to click through a bunch of links to get to this. And, you know, clearly this is not a best practice and might be construed as not even a prominent notice. Okay, some other examples of exploits. You go back to this favorite site, and after a little bit of time, suddenly you get this pop-up. And you say, oh, it must be for my favorite site. Maybe they want to give me something. And so I might click yes to this, I might not, but I might think it's part of this trusted site. But if you look very carefully at the screen, you'll notice that it's really this window underneath, that's the non-trusted site, that's popped up opportunistically this download experience. And so it's this associated trust that's actually not accurate. The user doesn't have enough context because it's hidden. And we call this a pop-under exploit. We've seen these. This was my favorite, which was this cancel means yes. This has all the elements. It ties into blue screens of death and other motifs. But if you read it, it actually says the words system update, security update, and there's somewhere privacy protection update. 3 different flavors of updates that this is for. Clearly they used every buzzword in the book to get people's attention. And they even throw in our name, Microsoft Corporation, and they say Windows is a copyright of Microsoft Corporation, but lo and behold, Windows isn't even referenced in this whole thing. They put it there just simply to add some credibility to their message. And what's wild about it is that every one of these buttons, including the little X in the corner, are non-functional. This thing is just an image. And if you click anywhere on this thing, you're taken to the download experience of this site. Now, most users can't figure that out. I can hover over it and actually get the little image toolbar in the corner. I know it's an image. But, you know, this is basically a spoofed user experience. Clearly deceptive because it's lying to you. The buttons are non-functional. Now, here's a different flavor of that same exploit embedded inside a web page. This looks like a regular window again with real yes, no, cancel buttons. And it's got some other elements. It says your computer is being attacked by adware and spyware. And, of course, how do they know? Did they actually run a tool to figure that out? I mean, this is quite an assertion. But even so, there are these buttons, but lo and behold, it is yet still just a picture. It's just an image. You click anywhere, and you're taken off to the site for a download experience. Another way people get this stuff is they leave their front door open. There is a security setting in IE. There's a low setting, and even one slightly above it, that potentially generates no user experience for a download. If you visit a site and they want to download software onto your machine, if you set it this low, it means you trust everybody on the internet. And you give them full rights to download anything they want. Clearly, as a user interface component, this is kind of a very dangerous thing to set, because you're leaving your front door wide open for anybody to drop whatever they want in what we would call a drive-by download. So in XBSP2, we actually took on a number of these exploits, and we actually have mitigations for a number of them. Let me show you what we did. The first is a pop-up blocker, which I think everybody knows about and has used these things with other tools. The nice thing about the pop-up blocker, in addition to providing you some notice and choice, there's a new information bar in IE that tells you that things are blocked. And you know, it's one of the main sources of these propositions. So if you can limit the number of pop-ups, you limit the number of times you have to make a decision about the trustworthiness of a software download. Okay, next is this new download blocker, which I think is pretty clever. It basically suppresses unsolicited downloads, or what we call forced downloads. This is when you visit a website and it tries to jam a piece of software down at you. This would normally interrupt your user experience. You'd have to immediately make a decision. You'd have to stop what you're doing and click yes or no. Now, this is exactly how I got spyware in my system, because my kids, when they're playing games, would occasionally surf to the web, and they would encounter one of these dialogues, and it would just show up in their experience, and they would just click away to get rid of it. And of course, ironically, they can't even read. So I don't really have much hope that they might hit yes sometimes, no the next time. The fact that my kids have to accept, deal with these kind of trust decisions is kind of a flaw in how we think about the experiences that certain classes of users get. But anyway, this suppresses that download onto the information toolbar and says, hey, look, someone's trying to force a download on you. If you really want this, click here and you can get it. So my kids could actually discover it here by accident. But the likelihood is not very high, since it doesn't interrupt their experience. So that is a big difference in terms of what we can get to happen. In addition, there's some clever logic in terms of whether you clicked on a link to get to this point. If you initiated the download, then it will just go through normally. You'll get the security warning with no additional folder roll with this information bar. And so we logically look to see how it happened, whether the site was forcing it or whether you initiated it. So I like this feature. Then we did some cleanup on these install prompts. Here's side by side, so you can kind of see what went on here. The left is the original with the run-on name field. On the right, first off, it's been really cleaned up. There's not all this noise about certificates and stuff like that, because quite frankly, all the certificates tell you is that someone paid some money to a certificate authority, and maybe they have an address. It tells you nothing about the intent of the software. It doesn't tell you what that software is doing. It doesn't give you any real clue of whether you used to say yes or no, other than perhaps the provenance of the publisher. But this new cleaner one basically says the name, and now that big long thing gets truncated after one line. And so, hey, look, if someone tries to do this kind of trick, it's going to look pretty obvious that something's not right. It should just simply be a name field. We also added this option called Never Trust a Publisher. Clearly, in the early days, it was always trust a publisher, because for convenience, that's very naive. There aren't that many publishers I would do that for. I think it's more likely you would say never trust to a bunch of other publishers. Anyway, so this is the new security warning install prompts that have been cleaned up.
Question.
Yes?
How is the publisher updated? Like, can I now trick users into never trusting Microsoft? Or?
Well, the user has to decide who to trust and who not to trust right now. There's no subscription to a list.
I'm asking if I can I spoof being Microsoft?
Not easily, but I mean, the issue is that the question is, what level of checking do certificate authorities do on name collisions? So if I have something with Microsoft misspelled by one letter, or PayPal misspelled by one letter, can they still register a domain like that? The sad answer is often they can. So when we get to phishing, I'll talk about strategies of how to avoid some of that risk. But it's a good point. Unfortunately, people could still come very close to the URLs that you've reserved.
Follow on. Can you go back and figure out what you've accepted, what you haven't?
Yeah, there's actually a blocked publishers list that you can manage through an interface. At least I think there is. I could be wrong, but I think there is. Now, with
one thing also about that last slide, what do you actually get if you click on the bit of text that says how to know which publishers to trust?
Oh, you actually get a consumer education piece that basically explains, do you know who this vendor is? Did you go directly to their link? Did somebody tell you about it? The associated trust aspects. And obviously, if you're unsure about the trustworthiness of a particular publisher, then don't go there. Call them up. There's any number of low-hanging fruit technology solutions you can do to figure it out. Ask a friend. Okay, so with respect to security, there's a new policy that says you can't set it past medium. If you try setting it to low or medium-low, it actually pops back up to the medium setting, and you get this warning. This is pretty hardcore, but we felt it was really important because you remember we're talking about the 99% case of users that really don't need to set their setting this low. Now, for those expert users that really want to go to these places and do things, there's advanced tabs you can get to and hand select the level of granularity of the access you want. But you obviously know a lot about what you're doing at that point. The issue is for the general user not to fall into a trap. Now, this is not a very elegant way to do an interface. I mean, why give someone an option they can't select? Okay? I totally agree. But when you look at the situation, which is, we're about to ship XP2, the thing's locking down, we say, this door is still wide open, can we close it? We said, yeah, we have a very quick way to limit this damage, even though it's not very elegant. So we chose with the expedient solution rather than a more elegant one that would have reduced confusion to the user. It's better than nothing, but I still think it's a good step in the right direction in terms of safe by default. Okay, there's also a new add-on manager, and one of the things that happened was a lot of these spyware programs end up becoming browser helper objects and toolbars, and there isn't a lot of exposure of these entities within the system. People don't know they're there. And while I won't say this interface is for the normal user, this is really for expert users and support professionals. Like if my mom called me up, I might ask her to run this and tell me what you see. But this at least now shows you which browser helper objects are installed and gives you the opportunity now to actually neutralize them by disabling them and making them non-functional. Now, it would have been nice to actually remove them, but as many of you know, removal of spyware is sometimes really difficult. They squirrel away hundreds of redundant entries in the registry. They have little tickler programs that remember that they've just been deleted and re-download the software behind your back. There's it's very hard to uninstall. What you can do, though, is remove it from the chain of execution. So this still helps in terms of being able to get your control back of your system until you can then do a real cleanup with a real cleanup tool. An anti-spyware tool, for example, or antivirus tool. Yes?
There's not going to be any spyware removal software associated with
The
this?
Microsoft does not currently ship dedicated anti-spyware removal software. What we do is in our customer education sites, we do list a couple of links to some well-known spyware vendors, anti-spyware vendors, so people can at least access them. That isn't to say those are the only ones that work, but at least people have direct connection to, I've got a problem, here's how I can start fixing it, and we tell them to do that, since we don't currently offer that.
So somebody who has a system which is probably infected with some kind of spyware, as most of them are now, by going to XP2, nothing's going to get any better about that automatically.
Well, with respect to already being infected, you now have at least some ability to control it through these interfaces.
You'll be able to see it there?
Yeah. If it's a browser helper object that's running, you can now just actually turn it off.
What other goodies are there besides browser helper options?
Say that again?
What other goodies are there that might be infecting my system as spyware?
Plenty. There are many attachment points, and we could talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is not in any way any slam dunk solution or anything like that. We're just saying, hey, come on. This is the browser. It's one of the more common ways it's happening. Let's at least expose some visibility to these objects so we can start seeing what's going on and giving users some empowerment, albeit it's somewhat cumbersome and not very direct, but it's still better than not having any. Okay, so moving on. The holistic strategy for deceptive software. It's got 5 prongs. And this recipe is very familiar. It's the one we use for spam. And it can really be used for many things, even phishing. So the prongs lay out in terms of consumer education. And we launched a new portal, which is www.microsoft.com/spyware. That's where those links are for those third-party tools. There are a number of technology investments, some that are rolling out and others that we're currently looking at. There's industry cooperation. There's, of course, these concepts of best practices we'll talk more about, which is a key to self-regulation. We've been active in some working groups. I know Peter knows about many of these. CDT is one of them, the Center for Democracy and Technology. Working with enforcement to create better deterrence. We engaged the FTC. I actually presented at a workshop, and I know that we've been helping them with various investigations of certain bad actors. And then legislation as needed. And in this case, again, I was asked to go out and testify before Congress recently. Yes?
One thing that's not on the list is having some sort of list of known good software publishers, presumably not managed by Microsoft, but by some association.
That would be in the technology investments bucket. There's safe and block lists, and we'll talk more about those. But yes. Yeah, part of the issue, we could talk, if we ever were to drill down into these, there's the whole efficacy of these kinds of solutions, and you have the problem of whack-a-mole, where people can start moving around. Let's just say you had a block list for ActiveX controls. Well, what would it look like? What would be the class ID? Well, you could roll class IDs dynamically, and you'd have this very big list that keeps growing.
That's why I said non-good and not non-bad.
Yes. So, I mean, a safe list is certainly appealing, although it's very hard for certain vendors to keep their safe lists up to date. We've been talking with various companies. I don't think I can name them necessarily, but they've had trouble where they've killed their own sites because they failed to put them on their safe lists, and some part of their organization releases something without the other organization telling them, and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore, and now this is a big fiasco. Yes?
So I'd like to ask a question about what you didn't there may be business reasons that I want to do that, and that's trademark law. So let's say that I decided to put on a deceptive restaurant guy that looks like an objective restaurant guy, but is really all about a product. And I come up with a guy about yay big, about this shape, and this weird maroon color. That's going to look like it's a Gap guy. And even if I call it the Zeget guy, why it's a Gap suit on trademark or trade dress. That's what I was thinking about when I saw that some of the exploits which involve, some of the deceptive stuff, which involves, for example, popping up a window that looks like a Microsoft window that people have come to trust, and therefore it's piggybacking on the trust.
Yes.
Just like in the trademark.
I'm
sorry.
I was going to. It turns out we actually use that strategy, and companies use that strategy, especially in the phishing context, where it's even more direct, where the harm is clearer. And they will actually use trademark infringement as the motivation for why you should shut down site X. You just simply can't go to somebody and say, "Oh, I want you to shut down this site." You have to have a cause. And one of the causes that we've heard about some of the companies using, the eBays and the Citigroups, et cetera, is trademark infringement.
What I'm wondering about is a company called Microsoft, which has pioneered the design of particular kinds of, for example, Windows.
It's worth looking into. You're sitting next to an expert on the legal aspects. Yeah, it's an interesting angle. I think we'll continue. We'll look into that.
Fair enough. That's why actually I think I'm not sure how good that would be against phishing in terms of really kind of a bad guy. But I think as I understand, some of these are people who are these think of themselves as legitimate product vendors. They've got a footprint. They're trying to make money, but they're trying to use kind of underhanded tactics.
And for a lot of those, deceptive practices laws are on the books also. It's not that you get much different.
So here's what I'm thinking. Here's where I mentioned trademark for deceptive practices. Deception, as we also, I think I was talking about it in March. Deception is on a borderline question. So you say, well, we reviewed something. You say, well, it's not best practices. So it's not best practices the way you define best practices, but it's not misleading, or at least we claim it's not misleading. If you guys have a trademark in a particular design of a window, then in that case you can say, we won't let you use this thing unless you sign on to the best practices.
Right. So the way the hooks into getting people to use best practices, there's multiple methods. One is the value proposition, the fact that the economics of it, that the marketplace will reward you if you have the logo and people will actually visit your site. That's one. The other is as a condition to use certain technology as a licensing requirement is another.
That's right. And technology being the right to come up with windows that look like our windows.
Yes. So let me move into that space because it's where I want to be right now, which is the whole best practices discussion. I want to finish off this last bullet, though, legislation. One of the real tricky issues here is that obviously the people who are making laws for us, they get paid by making laws. So if they're not making laws, they're not doing their job. So they just want to sit there. Ira, I'm sorry if I'm oversimplifying this. This is my slightly distorted view of the world after having visited Washington just 3 times.
You thought you were actually treating them with far too much respect.
But the issue is that they tend to use very big hammers when they go after things with respect to the law. One of the things we're really concerned about is that we really want them to focus on bad behavior and not on the actual software features themselves, because clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the features are not necessarily the evil or bad actors. Yes?
You're right, of course, they may not be the bad thing. There may be good or bad uses for everything. If the bad uses are really very bad, and the good uses are not that significant, And the easiest way, or maybe the only effective way of killing off this bad behavior is just getting rid of this feature, then that may not be such a bad thing.
We'll look into that. The next slide is where I really want us to spend a little bit of time on. But just before we get there, one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that the people in Washington are not necessarily the best user interface designers. Okay? So I've seen some laws that were proposed that had very silly things in them, like you will in 18-point font display this notice of this form here. And I'm thinking, okay, so like in a 10-foot user experience in Media Center Edition, that's going to end up being this big and no one will see it. Or on my watch, which has intelligence, it's going to be huge and I won't be able to read it. It'll be 1 character per whatever second. I said, these guys aren't thinking. I mean, I don't want to say it that way, but it's just that it's a very challenging thing to craft these kinds of regulations, especially when you transcend from just identifying bad practices that should be illegal to what should it look like. Because you know what? I've sat here for 7 or 8 months drafting best practices, and I could tell you it's a slightly moving target, and no one has a lot of mileage on what these user experiences look like. So to suggest that you could codify them into law is quite a stretch. And we should all take pause and really be somewhat conservative with respect to embedding into law these kinds of designs. So while I think there are some things that belong in law, especially things that will stop harm, when you get into what should you do, I really think that's best left as a best practice for the industry to kind of figure out over time that needs to evolve. And you don't want to make something really brittle right out of the gate. So with that, I'm going to launch into this next slide.
2 sentences.
Yes?
I agree with that statement, and I agree with the bad acts and the focus, but the vetting is 50-50 or a little better than that. There will be legislation here for Congress. And so these silly laws you're talking about, some variation of it involving federal laws. So this is not some hypothetical thing. It's really quite possible.
Yeah, not only is it possible, it's likely. And to the extent that we can continue to educate, continue to suggest what the unintended consequences are, continue to actually help draft language that's less brittle, that really captures more of the essence and the spirit of what they're looking for without tying hands, I think is a good thing. But it takes a hell of a lot of energy. I know there's quite a few of these efforts in parallel happening. And just to go to all the meetings and try to provide enough mind share to the people who are making these decisions is very challenging. It's very hard. My hat's off to all the people who attempt to do it. But I think it's all in our best interest to engage as much as we can. So this is my picture of the world, range of behaviors. I mentioned that we want to focus on behavior, so what does that mean? Well, at one extreme, yes? Yes?
To what extent is spyware already illegal under existing law?
We'll talk about that in a second. But that is a good question. So on one extreme, I've mentioned deceptive practices, and we've cited some covert installs and covert reinstalls, and mislabeling user interface components and lying in your user interface are all elements of deception. They're pretty slam dunk. They're kind of black and white. And to the extent they actually violate existing laws, there's CFAA, there's the whole FTC's charter for deceptive and fraudulent practices. I mean, there's things that they can go after just simply by the nature of how it was presented. To the extent there are holes in these existing laws, perhaps they need to still have some things filled in. But that's still an exercise. So the next up in the continuum, in my opinion, is what I'll call questionable behavior. I showed you the run-on EULA that was inside the name field, and it did actually describe what it was doing. It was just kind of confusing. So it's hard to claim that it is pure deception, because they did tell you what it was doing. It just wasn't done very well. And quite frankly, if I were to write a user interface and I didn't do a great job of my wordsmithing, I wouldn't want someone to come to me and say I was deceptive. I'd like them to say, hey, you should make this clearer, and not actually have a big fine or anything. So there's questionable, and it usually results in a confusing experience. Then moving up from there, and I'll put this in gray because it's actually the big gray area that needs to be dealt with. The next up from the range is acceptable behavior, and this is where there's some common accepted set of practices that we think, yeah, that looks right. And what's missing is sort of the documents that we all share as an industry around what these acceptable practices are. But they essentially followed some set of minimum required practices. And moving up the continuum, I claim there are even exemplary practices. There are some vendors that seem to go out of their way to try to explain to you what they're going to do. Maybe this is the Google toolbar. I don't know if you've used it recently, but they kind of tell you what it's going to do. It doesn't load anything yet. It lets you find out all about its terms. It even has a nice uninstall. It's very clean. It's got all the elements that make it potentially a poster child for how things should be done. The earlier Windows Media Player 9 examples we showed you a couple times ago, I thought those were pretty good examples of trying to have disclosure and transparency to users. So again, these are following what I'll call some kind of optional best practices. Why did I say optional? Because it could be that the cost of doing them is prohibitive for every single company. And quite frankly, there is a little bit of market differentiation possible. You know, if you do this minimum set of practices, but yet you go above and beyond and you get some gold stars, then the marketplace can reward you. And you know, if I had a choice between two different products, both functionally were the same, but one had a much better and cleaner experience, I might choose the latter, the one that got 5 stars in Consumer Reports, even though functionally they were identical. So, with respect to the prongs of the strategy, enforcement lives in this area. And clearly helping out the FTC and working and dealing with laws that might fill in the holes in existing law, if there are any, you know, is a reasonable exercise to go through. Then we've got this idea of using technology to come in and start doing detection and prevention strategies within the system for this kind of stuff. But the problem is that you can't quite, you know, you can call some of this stuff really bad. Like antivirus companies have no problem putting certain kinds of bad software or malicious software on your lists. They don't get libel suits. But as soon as you start putting stuff that's just simply confusing and calling it spyware, as was the case with Gator, who actually won their suit, or they settled out of court, they won their libel suit against the company that called them spyware. And there was another one this week where another company won their suit, or at least there was a lawsuit. It hasn't actually happened yet. What was the suit, Ira?
I haven't seen the complaint yet. It's just somebody sued.
Symantec's being sued because they called something spyware when it wasn't. So as soon as you get into here, you can't start calling people names. So we got a little bit of a problem. We can't quite get through this gray area. Now, at the other extreme, yeah.
So the normal reaction of many companies, threat of libel laws, threat of understanding is, we better steer far clear of that, far clear of anything that might possibly raise a libel law. It costs a lot of money, usually not to lose extra money, win, but a lot to defend. But if your Consumer Reports or the New York Times, then your view is, well, we'll double check them, we'll put in the right qualifications, but then bring it on. That's part of our cost of doing business is in libel law. Because part of the value, in fact, in their case, much of the value they provide, the user is our willingness to take a stand on things that might possibly draw upon. I guess my question is, where do you see Microsoft doing it? Because you can imagine Microsoft being kind of the first category. You know, we're not the New York Times. We don't want to get sued. On the other hand, you can imagine saying there's enough value for us in going out there and trying to protect our users by informing them of what we think are bad practices, that we are kind of a publisher in that.
You want to take that, Ira?
Sure. It's a pretty complex question. We kind of break it up into a couple of clear bad practices, and are already some existing lists on the web of other people who collected rather than another really bad. Then we're trying to get some comfort in having tools that are fairly automated cases. And virus would be the virus, you know, it's liable, we think that there are some grounded on that category. Then you get into the gray area. The gray area, you have a couple of things. One is, should Microsoft be self-doing those evaluations? Is that a good idea? I think it could be a bad idea. The question of, you know, what standing does Microsoft have? But if something that goes on that is a competitor of Microsoft, now what happens to on that basis or out. We're very aware of that. So to the extent that a third party is making these up, or to the extent that our best practices might be broadly adopted by group players, that would give us an additional we say, well, everybody, we're all following. We're just following you. You're not. This is you're not doing whatever. We're trying to let this evolve. We're starting with kind of new bad cases. Develop things that might automatically given our way of thinking.
Second alternative, right? The marketplace, someone separately coming up with that quality issues. What is the process for
Yep.
policy?
But I think that that's what raises the question. One way of looking at it is these are issues that can cause problems, so we'll avoid them altogether. But if the newspaper is investigating something that, let's say, it's in the business of reviewing products, they may not feel there's due process requirements other than kind of put journalism
I
together.
think there's one is kind of spreading information. Another thing is something that's and so, the difference about those is not just one of this. It's that, then decide that they're going to believe that that's or, and I'm not saying this is necessarily that thing, but even when it's a third party creating this, there are lots of questions about what happens appropriately on the one list, there's just a lot of
So,
The more one worries about the directions, the more of a problem users have in protecting themselves, because everybody that is skittish, they say, we can't come up with
well,
user tools because of all these questions.
let me see if I can tie it back in. So one of these issues is okay, how do you deal with the right-hand side of the paper? And Ira was kind of starting to talk about best practices. So we feel that the way you make certification logo programs happen is you need a reference, and therefore you have a set of best practices that an industry or that logo program certifies, and then you know whether you're compliant or not. To some extent, some of these logo programs can have subjectiveness in them, like, yes, you've really gone out of your way to really explain this, and it's a really high-quality disclosure, but it starts to get a little subjective. On the other extreme, you've got deceptive practices, and those are clearly those black and white bad things. You've got this list of examples of bad behavior. A lot of these legislations now have a whole section dedicated to deceptive practices or what they look like. If you trip any of them, you're dead meat. Now, the gray area, what we thought about was, okay, to avoid the libel, we really need to kind of focus not on subjectivity, but really on objectivity. And so we have this concept of objective criteria. And so if you really think about it, there are three different documents, effectively, that need to be drafted and ratified. And I'm happy to report we actually have examples of all three. One is the examples of deceptive practices. We did that very early on, about 7 months ago, shared that with the FTC, and now we see a lot of that language in law, in proposed law and proposed bills, so we're very happy that got started, and we started focusing people on deceptive practices. We have the best practices that we've done internally that we've been ratifying for the last 7 months, which is here, which we want to talk about in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And then lastly, we have this stuff called objective criteria. And again, it tries to focus not on the quality of the disclosure, but is there one? Just black and white, yes-no type questions to certain existence or non-existence of certain kinds of control or disclosure. Is this thing auto-starting? Is this thing providing you a control or an opt-in? What is that experience? Now, each of these is for different audiences. So the deceptive practices really is for legislation and enforcement. The objective criteria is actually targeted at detection companies, people who want to make detection software so that they're safe, so there's sort of a safe harbor around what they're calling out as being bad, or potentially something the user should look at and take some action on. You can't call it bad necessarily. And the right-hand side says gold star, good, thumbs up, right? And the combination of all these three squeezes this gray area to the smallest amount, where there's still some getting squeezed out. They don't quite make the min bar, but they didn't quite get detected. because they didn't make the full objective criteria. And the smaller we can make this gray area, the better it is for everybody. And I will mention one other thing. A number of sessions ago, I came to you and told you about this concept of a trust scorecard and trust critics. Trust critics is this concept of someone you go to that you subscribe to because you like what they think about certain kinds of trust decisions, and you go to them because you think they offer good advice. This could be the Better Business Bureau, this could be a religious organization, this could be a friend, it could just be a whole community of people that you're just interested in hearing their opinion. But quite often it's just an opinion. You may still want to hear it. You may still use that to base your trust decision, but the liability is a lot less when you've got this big group of people stating opinions. That should also enter into maybe how you resolve this grayness, is that you tap the community, because they can take the heat. So if you think holistically now about this big space, we've got these different instruments for different purposes, for different audiences, and we think together as a system, we have an angle on how to start squeezing it a little bit and getting a little bit of relief from the total ambiguity that seems to be out there. Yes?
And then the idea is down the road, Microsoft could enforce this, that if it's not certified, I don't want it running on my computer. Is that?
Sure. I mean, take the WICL logo for drivers today. Users have an experience today that's still an optional one. I know, hey, I got a new piece of hardware. Suddenly the driver gets installed, and the OS comes back and says, you know, this is not a WICL signed driver. This is WHQL I'm talking about, WICL Hardware Quality Lab. Are you sure you want to run this thing? And often, sometimes vendors will ship drivers without the full verification process because they're running out of time or it's Veda or something like that. And you may know that I'm willing to take the heat for that risk. So you say yes or no based on now the state. But normally, you'd only want to run WICL certified drivers because you'll have a more stable experience. Same thing. When you go to download software and you're being propositioned, do you want to load X, Y, and Z? If it's got that good housekeeping seal of approval, you know you're going to get the full notice and choice experiences. You're going to at least make some conscious decisions about what it's doing. You could turn it off if you don't like it. That kind of stuff.
Can you go back to that slide? It might be ignoring the legal side of this. Apparently, this software is involved with a lot of crashes.
Yes.
That happen at Microsoft. Another technical option would be listing software involved with crashes.
So we already have actually something called dangerous controls. Are you familiar with this? In XBSP2, it actually monitors BHOs and other IE add-ons that are bad actors with respect to stability and puts them on the block list.
This is a technical decision as opposed to
yes.
practice. These things crash.
Well, it's
to what their process and things like that.
Yeah, it basically says as a criteria for why you might want to take somebody out of the picture. If it's causing your system to crash a lot, put them in a quarantine and let the user figure out what they want to do here. But at least the system's smart enough to recognize that and then proactively do that.
And that doesn't result in any of these problems that we've been talking about?
You still don't want to attribute necessarily 100% and negativity about it. I mean, you don't want to say this is evil. You don't want liability.
It's just crashing your system.
Yeah, it's just a flat observation. This piece of software is causing your system to be unstable. Disable, enable it. What do you want to do? You want to keep crashing? Go ahead. But
so my impression is this would affect a lot of the problem software you're talking about. Is that have you done that kind of overlap?
I haven't looked at the numbers to tell you, and I actually don't know. I'm not an expert on the dangerous controls interface. I mean, does anyone else here actually know? We'll take it offline.
If somebody might want to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Because that would be
it turns out that in our holistic strategy for deceptive software, there is actually even a bigger umbrella than deceptive software, which is unwanted software. This is software that not only is deceptive, it doesn't necessarily have to be deceptive, but has another element. Maybe it's a speed hog. There's a piece of software that seems to be using 90% of your CPU. You might want to think about whether you want to keep running this thing. Or it's crashing a lot. And that could just be unwanted software, independent of whether it was deceptive in the way it was loaded or ran. It was just poorly written or just uses a lot of resources and you just don't know, and it's always auto-starting. Right? So we have this whole concept of even a bigger umbrella called unwanted software. And that's another group, Paul Bryan is doing deceptive software, and they've just started going into that area of unwanted software with the core systems team to look at reliability aspects as an element to this engagement with the user about what to run and not run.
So unwanted software is really a bigger category. Speaking as a user, I would like to have unwanted software not running on my system.
Correct. And we actually have graphs of the pain points, and it turns out that there's sort of the element of deception and there's sort of like this other axis which has nothing to do with deception, which is impact on your system. And in both directions you care, especially in the upper quadrant. That's the really, really bad stuff. But even in some of these side quadrants, you still want to take action. So that's out of the scope of this discussion. But I advocate that we talk more about it in the future. So I've almost used up my time. So I think with respect to best practices, I'm going to give a high-level tour. You have a copy of it. I would be more than happy to hear your feedback on it and comments in writing or later. If we have a little bit of time, and I'll be at the dinner tonight, we could also talk about it. But let me give you a high-level tour without diving too deeply into these elements. Fred, you looked perplexed. Well, we have fishing to do, and I have an hour. So I just wanted to okay. So I thought another maybe 5-10 minutes on the deceptive stuff, and then move into a new topic. Does that work out for everyone? Okay. So I mentioned this was under development since November. It's been vetted with an awful number of teams here at Microsoft, a lot of the stakeholders. It's even gone through an executive review. And the result of doing best practices, you have to ask the question, well, do we have any house cleaning to do? Do we follow all these best practices? And the reality is, well, there's a couple of places, well, we don't quite follow them. And that's part of the life of living with legacy software. And so you have to accept that, and you either have to decide to change it or at least have talking points for the press when you decide not to fix it. But we've already started to do that analysis. This is very minor, actually. There weren't a lot of house cleaning to do. And most of it had to do with anonymous collection and not PII. So I think the risk was relatively low. Okay. Now the scope of the best practices, again, this isn't the whole enchilada. This was trying to narrowly focus on the most common elements of what's considered spyware or this deceptive software. So sharing personal data, or what I'll call web surfing behavior, which is the wide range of all your surfing, not just to a website, one website. The other is displaying ads, and it's not any kind of ads. It's really those that are in their sort of own distinct user experience where they're decoupled from the thing that controls them. We'll get into that a little bit more. Changing configuration settings, and this is more or less the hijacking case. Yes? So why don't we talk about that when we get to the ad section, because there's this whole kind of discussion around embedded versus standalone ads, and I think you're bringing up yet even another case, which you're talking about overlaying ads on top of other ads that cover them up?
Well, yeah, embedded or overlaying, and why are you setting off ads?
So the focus of the best practices deals with if I'm generating ads, what should I be doing? And the number one thing that causes people the problem is lack of control. It isn't that their ads are there, it's that they can't get rid of them once they're there. Yes, again, these best practices are really for developers to make sure they're not going to annoy users. All right? Yes?
So one thing that this doesn't seem to cover is anything on best practices for collecting user data. So for example, one might imagine that you would say if users are going to type something into a web page, there might be a requirement with a certificate for the page or something like that.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, the focus really is in the transfer across a trust boundary to some other location, not necessarily in the collection experience itself, if that's what you mean. And so you could expand it.
And it probably would help for, it would seem to me that it would help with the phishing.
Yeah, it could.
Hardware, we did that.
Let's talk about it in the phishing context, and we can tie it back to best practices. And then configuration changes are really not just any, because you know what, there's gazillion of these things all over the place. You've got to figure out what the bar is, and it's really those that substantially alter the desktop experience. That's kind of what we hit upon. We originally just narrowly focused on browser settings, but you know what, I mean, you've got the whole issue around file type takeover with respect to media players and things like that, and you still would like to have a consent experience when that happens. I don't think you really want one player taking over another player's settings without your consent, for example. So compliance, as I mentioned in that original slide, we wanted to create some headroom for these exemplary practices. So there's two flavors listed in the document. Required practices, which absolutely must be followed, and quite frankly, they're there either because there's a law or you're going to be called deceptive if you don't do them. And recommended practices, which are really stretch goals, which most of the time you're going to do because it's going to increase transparency and control, and it's good for end-user trust. The only reason you wouldn't do them is for one of three reasons. Because there's some technical limitation for you to be able to do it. Maybe it's just not possible to do it like a complete uninstall in this particular case. Or maybe there's a security reason. This is some kind of piece of technology that really needs to be there, and you've decided not to follow one of these recommended practices because it would defeat the whole purpose of the thing you're doing for security. And there's also business reasons. So there could be cost factors, and so you decide not to be the poster child, but you just do the minimum set that you need to do. So that's how these things work. You get some latitude with respect to recommended practices. So there is a catch-all in the document because obviously we'll miss a bunch of stuff. But and this is thanks to Scott Charney, who's here. We decided we would also avoid features that are provided for direct personal financial gain of somebody other than the user with no compelling direct user value in return. So this gets back to the horse trade. If you can't show a compelling value proposition for what you're doing, and if you can't, for the typical user, get them to see this as being a positive, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Because you're defeating the whole purpose of end-user trust. You're not really creating the scenarios that they'll think make any sense. There's also the case of offensive material. Clearly, you wouldn't want to put anything up there that could be construed as offensive, pornography, etc. And this whole concept of disrupting a user's desktop experience. Say you do ads, but you put them everywhere, and they have a frequency of display that's so great that you can never do any work. I mean, clearly that's a bad practice. Yes?
The poster child would be as an example for the first point. What's the bad practice?
What's the bad practice? I'm going to give you some meaningless piece of software in exchange for tracking you for the rest of your life. Well, you know what the gray area is. I mean, it's kind of like half and half. It's kind of like, well, for some people this program might be useful, but other people it isn't. And yet a lot of people just say yes, and they're getting a really bad deal, but they don't realize it. I don't want to name any names per se, but I can think of some that are not very compelling, but people are still hiding behind them as being legit. Notice and consent. We actually spent some time trying to describe in more detail prominent versus discoverable notices. And we started being a little more prescriptive about what needs to be above the fold with respect to what you see on the screen. Now, obviously, you can't really disclose everything you might want to disclose in the user interface you've got. So, for example, in the Media Center 10-foot edition experience, you only get 2 lines of text because it's huge. So you can't possibly go into details about what normally should be in a prominent disclosure. So what are you going to do? Well, in those cases, you really should be writing intelligent summaries of the substantive aspects and putting them there so users are tipped off to the fact that they are being tracked or it is personal information, and then offer some kind of learn more experience where you go to a discoverable notice to find out about these things. Because it's just not practical in every single disclosure to display everything. It's just not going to be achievable. So we need to think more about 2-tier notice systems and this concept of intelligent summaries. This now creates a huge challenge for EULAs because EULAs tend to be relatively long documents. They rarely fit on a page. And most lawyers will tell you not to write a separate intelligent summary within a EULA because now you're saying something twice as legal edict. And you have the chance that it's ambiguous. And you've really blown it. You really want to be succinct in these kind of documents. So, that suggests that EULAs are just really not a great prominent notice. And I think we all intuitively know that for users, very few will read them and get enough out of them. But no lawyer will tell you that a prominent notice isn't enforceable. Right? EULAs have to be binding, regardless of how they're written. And you might actually put on the last line of the EULA some element of disclosure that somebody says you should put at the first line. But that whole document is still an acceptable form. So there's still this challenge. We basically dealt with this in the best practices, saying that the recommended practices, obviously clear and easy to understand language, and going into a legal instrument to explain simple things to users is really not the way to go about it. And so you wouldn't be getting gold stars for that. On consent, quite frankly, there's a number of different subtleties to consent, whether you pre-check boxes or not. We know from user interface tests that people hit the next button all the time, and they are just flipping right by consent experiences, not even understanding what they said yes to. So in the cases where there's a substantive issue there, where there's a lot of sensitivity to the data, or it's like automatic updating, we don't pre-check the buttons. We make sure that the user has to make an intelligent choice, a deliberate choice, before they can click the next. That's basically a secondary action, if you think about it. And so that helps sort of double check that the user has engaged on the decision. And then fill-in-the-blank forms are fine, providing it's clear that you say where this data is going to and you hit submit, et cetera. That in itself is a prominent notice and consent. Yes?
Just one observation on consent. Probably the most objectionable part of the legislation that's moving through Congress would be to require a lot more consent checkoff as part of downloading software. That this is in the name of stopping spyware, there can be notice of consent in a whole lot of settings where cataloging through the practice of the format. And that practice of automatically checking things might become which makes best practices important, but it also means you might just be seeing a lot of clutter and dialogue boxes.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to know what to check?
The last time.
Yeah, it's sad. Okay.
There have been, you brought up the legal department, and the problem between, I think, usability, enforceability, and liability. We've talked about distilling notices. Is there any good research on this? Interdisciplinary research with legal folks and usability. But it's just an area that I think is really
There have been layered. There's the whole work with layered notices as an example of how far can you go. And I actually saw recently, I think it was in the IAPP flyer that just went out. We get this spam from the privacy group. Anyway, they said they went not only from a layered notice, but actually to one that was a summary, which was different than a layer. It was actually a simplified version that tried to transcend the legalese. So I don't know what's formal there. There has been on our side in terms of whether people click through or not, and that's why we went to these, you must click one of the buttons. Well, excuse me, that's in the consent experience. But in terms of EULA understandability, is that what you're getting to?
No, more, you're right, having the entire EULA up there is not helpful. Having an entire privacy statement up there is necessarily helpful. You want something that really promotes a consumer's ability to kind of quickly make an assessment. And so usability argues for something much smaller and perhaps stated in plainer language than many of these other documents are, which creates the ambiguity that potentially leads to some exposure and liability. There needs to be some reconciliation.
In the limit, you go not only through the textual representation, but to icons for behavior.
Yes.
All right. There's a little add icon, and there's a little collection icon, and to the extent those are internationalized symbols, everybody can see them. When you get a consent experience for installation, you get this little row of little boxes of the behavior of the software, and at a glance, is my favorite phrase, to be able to make these decisions at a glance is really what users want.
Internationalized symbol means that nobody knows what it means, right?
I'm just saying, in the limit. So someone actually proposed these. Someone recently proposed these. I think it was from Harvard and a whole bunch of other studies of these symbols, and they actually had a whole proposal of what this would look like. I don't know if anybody remembers seeing that. Yes?
Did you, in your prior response to Deirdre, say that Microsoft does have research on click-through rates and whether people read these things or not?
We have a UX team, a user experience team that does trust studies. I can't tell you whether they actually studied this particular aspect, but that's where I'd go to ask.
I mean, let me tell you why I asked, so it's not just a question, it's actually a point. I think a lot of people believe, I don't think universally believe, that nobody reads these things. That, in fact, that click, you want to download software, you click yes, I accept the terms, and that not one human being ever, with the exception maybe of colleagues at the table here, have ever read those boxes. So, if moving to a system of lots of, we're going to give you notice, and
I understand it might be legally the right thing to do. It might even be ethically the right thing to do. It'd just be interesting to know.
It won't be efficacious, okay? It won't be efficacious necessarily, and that is the challenge, you know. And this will be the fallout of this whole exercise. Yes.
So in the privacy world, we've gone through the same thing, and we've done some testing with privacy policy and immutability, and looking at IE6's interpretation of P3C from the privacy version and whatnot. But so the next step, besides having the notices, is then have your browser make automated decisions on the basis of that. So like what you're doing with blocking cookies. Do you have in mind doing something like that with spyware policy?
So when it came to the objective criteria, one of the concepts was, can we give them the high, medium, low setting for safety? And based on the criteria, the objective criteria, it automatically filtering and then you know, being channeled to different experiences by default. So the user didn't have to figure it all out by examining the objective criteria manually. So yes, the same general concepts are there. I am not an expert on what manifests itself right now in the system. I know they were looking at it. I can't say what's actually on the books. Yes?
So I was wondering, a concrete example of this. Here's one thing that came to mind whenever I look at the referrer logs for my web log. I find that there's a list of email referrers and hard drive referrers. They just have people's names. So I know who's a web log. I'm not sure they know that.
Interesting.
So how, on the other hand, also there are a lot of the referrers are from websites. So what I then know is that the user went to this website before he went to my website. It's kind of interesting for me, but I doubt that most users would be upset about it. How would you suggest that this, I'm just raising this to concrete example, I'm trying to figure out what it means from the notification experience required privacy. Should it just say, we're about to transmit in the HTTP referrer field a URL representing your mailbox?
So let me explain this best practice, okay? I really need to focus now just on the best practices. I actually won't take as many questions so we can get through to the next section. Not that I don't want to hear them, just catch me afterwards. So on information sharing, this issue really came up, like in legislation, when do you provide prominent notice and choice? We all know if you take personal data, you have to have a notice and choice experience. No one here is debating that. The issue is, when do you have it? Some people would like to have that at install time. Like before you even install a piece of software, you should know that it has the potential of collecting your personal information. And then make a decision at that point. It's like, well, you know, I guess, but I think about experiences like registration in Windows. All right, the Windows registration experience, you know, pops up after you've installed Windows, and it says, hey, do you want to register? And if you want to register, you're going to give us this personal information. Here's how we're going to use it. Is that okay or not? Blah, blah, blah. And there's a context to that collection, and it's all self-contained. If I were to, you know, ask you that at the very beginning, you did have this extra consent experience where you're not even doing the registration itself. You're just being told, by the way, this software will register itself. I mean, what value is that? And likewise, take the Windows error reporting. When a program crashes, you have this opportunity to send off this error report. The experience pops up, says, hey, you know, you've crashed. I might be able to find a fix for you. Do you mind sending this stuff off to Microsoft? Here, you could look at what's being sent. You can make the decision. Yes, no, go. If a person had to make that decision a priori when they first installed the system, they don't have a lot of motivation because they're not in the middle of a crash. They really, when they're crashing, they really know they want to fix, so they really decide that at this point I'm ready to say yes. And also they could see the data that's actually being sent to decide whether or not it's risky. So to blindly say that the collection should always happen at install time, this notice and choice, doesn't seem right to me. So the best practice really suggests that, look, before you actually execute the feature that's going to transfer that data across the trust boundary to some other place, you as a user need to have the right to say no or yes. Now that can happen any time before the execution. It can happen at installation time. That's certainly very valid. But it could also happen in just-in-time consent, just before it's happening, in the context where there's maximum context for the operation. This is one of the big arguments in the education we offer at the legislators to get this concept of just-in-time consent into the taxonomy. Because up until then, it was all at install time, which is just going to create an awful lot of dialog boxes to users where they don't have a lot of context. I can imagine 50 of these things showing up when you first boot Windows. I mean, there's so many things that potentially could do this stuff where it's much better to wait for the context. So we ended up with this as the rule, just as an example. On advertisement display, I just want to mention a couple of things here. We looked really deeply at how advertisements were being displayed and what the real issues were. And quite frankly, when I visit a website, I do expect ads to be there for the most part. I'd be actually surprised if there weren't ads on a website. Now, I'm not really worried about ads on a website that are embedded in the frame of the web page. Why? Because they're part of that site. If I don't like the site, I traverse off it, I hit next, I X out the window. I have total control over that experience. Also, they're not crawling all over the place. They're bounded by the frame of the window. So for me, the control is there implicitly because they're, quote, embedded in the experience. The ads that are the worst, that people complain the most about, are essentially, and I don't want to pick on pop-ups per se, but pop-up ads that pop up independently of where they're coming from, that have no attribution inside the ad itself of who put it there, with no instructions for how to stop them from happening. Your best bet is to close down the single ad you saw, but another one shows up right after that. So in my mind, it's that total lack of connection to the program that's generating them that is the root issue to be discussed here. So the best practice turns around and says, hey, look, if you want to do ads, first off, if you do them embedded, get a jail free card. That's kind of how most people do it today. I don't want a consent experience before I visit a website saying, warning, this website may display embedded ads. Is that okay to you? Come on. All the web pages do that. That's kind of an expected experience. So I wouldn't require one there. On the flip side, I would require some kind of control and attribution when those ads get displayed. Yes?
I guess the language you're using embedded, so you're saying embedded by the person who's controlling that website. I mean, there are some of the deceptive, or, how you feel about, I don't even want to use deceptive, but there are programs that are writing over the ads that would otherwise be embedded by the person who's the primary displayer of the website, not with the consent of the person who's giving you the website.
Yeah, that's different.
Yeah.
So that's someone hijacking someone's website for advertisement. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, you might call it hijacking. I mean, I could have chosen that I want to use somebody else's ads, or somebody else could have, surreptitiously put some software on, there's lots of different contexts, but where would that, I mean, they are standalone ads in that they're not being provided by the website owner.
If I have control as a user, can I stop them from happening? How do I control them?
Some of them no and some of them yes.
Okay. Let's talk offline about this scenario because it sounds interesting to me. But for the lion's share of the spyware problems or the unauthorized adware problems, it's essentially these pop-ups that also show up even when you're not browsing, that are just popping up on your screen because there's a resident piece of software, on your system generating these ads that you can't find, that's not in ad remove programs, or if it is there, it puts itself back there within minutes. So it's that total lack of control, total bad behavior that I'm trying to get at. The last one's configuration changes. That's actually pretty simple. Just provide a notice and consent experience prior to running and executing the thing. Let me know you're going to take over my home page or search page. I think that's courtesy. We also added some disable and install requirements, and it basically is said like this. You've got to provide a mechanism that's easy to discover and use that allows you to disable and completely uninstall the components, and it's a recommended practice. So why is it recommended? Why isn't it required? Well, because we have examples in our own system where you can't do this all the time for technical reasons, security reasons, or business reasons. So we'll say it's recommended, and if you fail to be able to do it, then the best practice is to then provide a person notice and choice about it prior to the installation, because if something's that sticky, I want to know about it. But you know what? It may be okay that it's that sticky, as long as I knew up front before I started making my, my computer kind of weird. This is equivalent to going in and getting a set of tires at a car dealership, at some tire place. And they say, these are the best tires in the world. They could last a lifetime. Oh, by the way, we're welding the lug nuts on. You can never take this off. I think I'd want to know that before they did the work. But I still may say yes, because these are the best tires in the world. I mean, it's up to me. It's a horse trade I want to know about. But it isn't that the uninstall should be legally required. It's that a person should know if there are gotchas with respect to the software. And this is, again, one of these unintended consequences of simply blindly saying everything should have an uninstall. Yes?
I'm not sure I agree. I hard to do. Maybe that's not where the current state of the software technology is, but
Let me give you another example.
well, I just wonder whether that shouldn't be our goal, is that any piece of software can be uninstalled. It's hard for me to see it.
Let me give you an example.
That's a real terrible world.
Let me give you an example. Some manufacturer decides to make a toaster with an advertisement display on the side. You get this toaster for free because it's got this embedded display and it shows you ads in the morning. Okay? You come back and you say, you know what, legally you have to give me an uninstall. I don't want to see the ads anymore, but I still want to make toast. As a manufacturer, am I required to give you an appliance that can be disabled and you can use pieces of it? I don't think so. I think I should be able to package up something that doesn't have an uninstall, that still has that behavior, because that's the horse trade. And you could decide not to buy it if you knew up front that you're not going to be able to pull that display off and use it separately.
It's kind of an theoretical conversation, but I'm talking about computers, not about toasters.
Well, the thing is, it's appliances, and we have a lot of examples of computers becoming appliances. So unless you're willing to define computer system to not also mean appliance-like devices that are somehow dedicated devices, you've got this whole slippery slope to go down to properly craft the definition of computer. Yes?
What is the purpose of this best practice? Are we going to bring lawsuits based on it?
Yes.
But I don't think it's a good idea.
Oh, you're talking about the best practices or the legislation? No, the best practices is so users can tell trivially through a logo or some other thing. The whole point of best practices is to be able to tell the good actors from the bad actors.
Okay, so this is someone who's going to put on a logo.
Yes.
Promulgating you best practices.
Yes. It says, I adhere to the good practices of XYZ.
Suppose that I'm that person who's putting on the logo. I publish these best practices and I deny someone a logo. Can he sue me based on what I said in the best practices for denying them the logo?
Well, it depends if they're in violation of the... You can't give someone the logo if they're not following the practices.
Suppose that I refuse to give them the logo.
Well, I don't...
They claim that they are following the practices.
That's an old problem.
Yeah.
I understand. What's the answer?
The answer is it's deception if the company claims that it's following the practices and it isn't. And then it stops being able to use the rating.
You're not answering my question.
You can't arbitrarily deny something.
What's the meaning of arbitrary?
They're following all the practices that they submit and they follow your procedure. You cannot just deny them.
It's unavoidable that the practices are going to be ambiguous. That's the point of the discussion we've been having for the last 15 minutes. And the question I'm trying to answer is, does it matter? Is it a goal to try to make the best practices unambiguous?
Yeah.
Guidelines are not ambiguous.
Because the question, you're using the guidelines to say it doesn't mean that
I'm asking a very operational question. We've been having a big, long discussion about the interpretation of various aspects of these best practices. Does that really matter? Well, or is it fundamentally a question of what the person putting on the logo thinks? And if you don't like what that person thinks, then you don't pay any attention to their logo.
Argument goes like this. Microsoft writes deliberately ambiguous best practices because somebody comes in and says, I'm subscribing to your best practices. Microsoft says, well, we could do it itself. Well, we really didn't need it that way, and says, no, you can't have it. And now there's some kind of a court case. And the question is, would Microsoft go ahead with that court case? Because if the answer is no, and you wouldn't deny things like this, then it's not worth the energy of making things like this. That's part.
Yes. Well, I don't think it would be possible to make things ambiguous. I think a lot of discussions on that are a waste of time.
The probability
It doesn't have to be. But it has to be, you have to have reached the point where we can make a risk assessment and we're willing to bear that on the person.
So the strategic question is Microsoft would be willing to go to court.
We're not going to administer best practice.
You're going to support some other organization.
Right.
We probably prefer a third party.
Yeah. And
Microsoft logo.
It wouldn't be a Microsoft logo. We really don't want to be in the business necessarily of certifying people, but here's how the game works. Each of these industry organizations out there all heard the FTC's call for best practices are the key to self-regulation. If you haven't got them, we're coming after you. All right? So they want to establish best practices to avoid FTC, scrutiny. So the industry as a whole, different pockets of people, OPA, you name it, are all spending cycles trying to come up with best practices. And when you start trying to actually write them down, you realize it's kind of tricky because of all these subtleties. We've spent 7 months thinking about these subtleties. We think we have an angle on some of them. It seems reasonable to engage with these groups, depending on the politics and the strategy, to get to a single set for the industry, or a single one that kind of sticks to the wall for a little bit. Well, then that organization then administers that particular logo or policy, and then we can potentially look at it within the interface and say the user has the option to tell whether or not something has this particular logo, and we can load it or not based on that logo's presence.
In the context of wet seals, that's the easiest way to draw potential end game.
So the value of a seal comes down to how consistent are they in offering that seal, and how tight are their rules, and what does it really mean to get the seal. Like trustee has the problem that, a lot of times people will say, well, the trustee seal means it must be great for privacy. Well, not necessarily. It just says that there will be a disclosure that tells you what it's doing. But it doesn't actually say necessarily exactly what the behaviors are. That seal is not sufficient to tell you the details of that you really need to know, which is what is the behavior and whether it's acceptable to you, right? It's not a shorthand for acceptance per se. So each seal has a different level of value to an end user of what it means. UL to me means I'm not going to get electrocuted when I plug it in. That's what it means to me. But it may mean things to other people. You're shaking your head. Sorry I gave you such a headache.
Well, the path has been gone down numerous times before for other problems. It happened for privacy in the late 90s.
It didn't work.
Well, it worked for the industry that didn't want legislation because there was no legislation.
That's cool. It had no actual value for privacy.
Well,
it was great.
Except
I support that wholeheartedly.
that over a 3-year period, you went from fewer than 10% of commercial websites having any privacy policy, having over 90% of websites having privacy policy.
Sure, nobody pays any attention to you.
What do you mean by nobody pays any attention to it? I think the FTC certainly pays attention.
No, I'm sorry. Nobody ever goes to a website, looks at their declared privacy policy, and behaves any differently based on what they see.
I'm not sure that's true.
I would love to see some data on that.
Sure. We can give you the click-throughs for people who actually go to the Microsoft privacy statement on a monthly basis. If you look at some of the data.
What are the numbers?
Who? Well, that would be surveillance company.
So let me just say, I think you have a valid point, which is, think more bigger about what the real value of the logo ultimately is going to be. Very valid. We should continue to think deeply about that.
And these nitpicking discussions is exactly what one of those sentences means.
Right. If you go to the 30,000-foot level where you're at, it's a very interesting place to look back down and say, what are you really getting at the end of the day? You mentioned the strategic value of dealing with the FTC, and I think no one's debating that that's a problem. Plus the value of having something that represents the goodness when you're dealing with legislation, right? So you have a little bit more clarity. So you could recognize bad laws when they're being drafted, right? But in terms of the end of the day, what this logo really means, yes, we need to continue to look at that and decide, can we actually add value there or not? Fair? Great. Okay, so phishing. I understand. So guys, we've got 30 minutes. Less than 30. Do I have 30 minutes?
You got 30 minutes plus just a 30-minute break afterwards. So if you want to, then jump Jeff.
So are we okay? Shall we now dive into the phishing, or am I losing people?
Dive into phishing.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do it. Okay, guys, phishing, my favorite topic. So I think most of you already know the external situation around phishing. There's an awful number of people falling for scams. I think there were 57 million attempts evaluated by Gartner last year. That means 30 million people received a phishing exploit. Another 27 actually clicked through it. Another 2 million actually provided their personal information and financial data to the scammers in last year alone. And the tricks are definitely getting more elaborate. There's a lot of blended threats. I'm going to show you pictures of some of these things. I know people are getting multiple emails, whole big social engineering scams with eBay. And at the end of the day, though, technology can't solve everything. Some users are just too overly trusting. Scams still work on the telephone. Someone just calling up, pretending to be somebody or getting people to give them money. So there's still a social element that's hard to address with just technology. The other problem is phishing is still very profitable for the bad guys. The economics are clearly in their favor. They still can send out a lot of spam and get enough hits. So unless we can tip the economics, this could be a challenge. It's clearly a huge concern for e-commerce. I think if you talk to anybody in that sector, they're really nervous about the erosion of consumer confidence in e-commerce. It's a major problem. $2 billion in losses alone last year. And it depends on how you measure it. I've seen numbers bigger than this.
What does that mean? Can you post money?
Well, no, I mean, a lot of times the banks will cover because they don't want to have the whole ecosystem fall apart. They're still making enough through these other methods. But it's getting so expensive that they can't sustain that. Plus, some users are actually getting directly hit, and they do have to pick up some of the tab, depending on the kind of exploit. So financial partners, and we have quite a few of them, big players, they want action. They want to know, what are we doing about it? They feel like we have some component of the solution that we should be offering. So let me show you how hard this problem is. Here's an example of an email that's a phishing email. It looks very bona fide. It comes from a spoof sender, and it has an URL in it that talks about Citibank right here. And of course, underneath the covers, it's not Citibank. It's a spoofed URL. And a user will click on this, and it will launch the fake site. But they're getting very clever. The fake site will immediately redirect to the trusted site and launch this page, which is the Citigroup page. And quite frankly, I cut off the bottom here, but there's actually the lock symbol and everything else. And it is truly the trusted site. What's so insidious about it is it leaves behind this pop-up, which is really for the untrusted spoof site. And it's basically a sign-in page. There's no URL. There's no lock symbol. There's no crumbs left over for the user to figure out that this is a spoof. So since you have the main page on the screen, which is the true Citigroup page, with this fake pop-up which asserts you should sign on, people fall for this. I'd fall for this. This is very nasty. So that's what we have to contend with, and this is just one example of many. So the internal situation within Microsoft about this topic is that we have a number of internal efforts all trying to address different elements of the problem. One is the anti-spam group, which is now called the safety group. MSN, IE, Outlook, the whole security team. LCA has enforcement actions. There's the whole Project Protect for Education. So there's a lot of things going on. Some are tactical, some are more strategic. But clearly there's a lot of these independent efforts. I was asked when I joined the security team to lead a phishing task force for Microsoft, whose purpose in life was to coordinate these company-wide activities and establish a more holistic roadmap over how to address this problem. And look at all the different things we're doing to make some sense of it, to make sure that we actually are doing the most we can at the right moment in time. So reducing any overlap between the efforts, spotting holes, and filling in any strategy holes in the strategy. So this task force got launched in the middle of June. So I thought about this problem, and every day that I went home, my head just kept hurting because I kept trying to jam into it all the different scenarios I heard about phishing and all the different ways it happened. So I said, maybe there's some way to visualize this, and this is really for my own health. I blurted out onto this piece of paper this map which tries to capture the whole ecosystem end to end of what I currently think about with respect to phishing. It isn't necessarily complete, but it does give us a framework to think about the problem and then refer back to when we think about tactics. So let me give you a tour. You should each have a handout, and the top page on that handout is this picture. So it starts off here in this lower left-hand corner where some phisher decides to send their evil email. And it typically goes to some spam distribution system where it either gets directly sent over to the email providers or some bot farm is being used where they distribute spam through that method. Anyway, it's a very fat arrow going to the email providers. Those email providers, some of them have filtering technologies, which we'll get into, but at some point, some amount of that mail does end up on the user system. The color code here is everything in reddish pink is bad. Everything in blue is a trusted web service or trusted entity, and everything in this greenish color is the user. All right? Anything in a dotted line is a covert action. So as you come across onto the user system, they essentially receive that email with the bait in it. And they, at that point, will tend to view the bait. Now, they might preview it in the Outlook or whatever. So one thing happens right away at that point. In the past, there have been vulnerabilities in Outlook and OE which can be exploited, which then immediately install through this covert path a keystroke logger, which, once you have that happen, obviously the bad guys can get a rich set of data across many, many websites. But the main path through the picture is the most common path. It's like the 95% case. Most of the phishing exploits happen through the main path through the center. So the user at some points clicks on the spoof link in their email and they launch the browser. The browser then launches, and the next box over says the user views the spoof site. And the most simple thing is they just see the spoof site, they think it's real, they enter the data, and the bad guys are off to the races, and the phisher gets the information, and we'll talk about the back end in a minute. But I counted at least 4 different ways that the phisher gets this data. Going back to the email, you basically, once you see the bait, the user can just simply enter the information, often an HTML email where there's a fill-in-the-blank field. They could simply put it in there. Or they could just simply reply to the email in clear text even and provide them the information, as would be a telephone call that they might receive. So the user information is entered, and boom, it goes all the way over here to the bad guy directly, skipping the browser completely. Some of these other paths of the browser are interesting. After you launch the spoof site, the box on the very top that's pink, and I don't have a laser pointer, which would be really great if David's around. Yeah, do you have one? Yeah. Oh, wow. That'd be great. Woohoo. You come prepared. How do you turn it on? Oh, excellent. Look at that. Okay, so we basically have this box right here, which, if you could read it, it says that this is where the bad guy site redirects to the trusted site and launches a pop-up. And then the user enters the data in the pop-up instead of on the spoof site. And again, the phisher gets it. Then the keystroke logger path, there's actually a number of different ways this shows up. I'm going to go through some of them over here. One of them is the user simply accepts an unsolicited download. This is like my kids clicking onto a security warning and saying, yes, I accept the download. And inside there's a keystroke logger. Another one is the user accepts the download and they actually knew they were getting it. And it had piggybacked on it a keystroke logger. So for example, say someone goes to, not that anybody does this, to some porn site, and there's some titillating little tool that they got to download, and as part of that tool, inside there's a keystroke logger. Again, you don't know where you're getting this stuff from, and it's just essentially a carrier for this particular payload, which happens to be a keystroke logger. So that's another way this happens. Then we mentioned leaving your front door open where the security setting was too low. You could end up with that. And this last path is this very recent download.jek exploit that you may have heard about, that a lot of people were talking about. The way this one worked is that the bad guys exploited a trusted site, the server of the trusted site. There was actually some weak settings that some of the administrators had left, and they were able to put a payload down here, which was an evil script. And so when you visited Toys R Us or whatever it was, it didn't have to be a phishing site or anything. You got this evil payload, which then exploited an IE vulnerability, which then loaded the keystroke logger. So that's yet another way this could happen. Now, once the keystroke logger is there, you end up watching all your keystrokes, scraping your screen, and again, this data is sent off to the back end. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. The phishers then select their victims. We've heard of all sorts of anecdotal stories about how this happens. Sometimes they'll actually look at your credit limits. They'll look at your physical banks or what banks you're participating in. And in Australia, for example, they have really promoted the use of electronic commerce to most of their populace. So many, many people will have electronic banking, which includes account-to-account transfers. Well, that seems kind of silly, but that's what they allow. So the bad guys set up a phony account at these banks. They then get their mules, the people who carry money around, to go to the banks and actually make a withdrawal. And it's all synchronized. And what happens is the electronics do the electronic fund transfer from your account to the phony account at the same bank. The mule walks in 2 minutes later, takes out the money, and then walks away, and they leave that account dormant for the rest of its life. They've already done what they needed to do. And typically, they'll be just under the $10,000 limit for reporting, so that it's not discovered right away. So that's kind of how this stuff works. And I kind of looked at two major classes of fraud in the back end. One is a bank fraud where they have your credentials for your bank and they can do these transfers and actually move larger sums of money around. And the other kind of fraud is more purchasing fraud where you're using a credit card and doing unauthorized purchases. Now, once they succeed and they actually have the money and they take it away, the back-end enforcement folks can actually click into play. They can do a follow the money strategy, which is a more traditional organized crime detection strategy, where they can watch the money flows. Also, the banks and the credit cards can report into enforcement in terms of giving them information and helping track these bad guys down. This is a worldwide problem, so it requires the cooperation of all these different jurisdictions and enforcement agencies. So it is very challenging to get instant turnaround when you want to have certain things to happen. But to some extent, if we're lucky, we can then find and jail the bad guys, and if you do this well enough, you might start to tip the economics. Now that's just aspirational, because clearly organized crime has been around a long time, and they simply find something that's a little more profitable to do. So the two key strategies here is creating a choke point for the original spam that comes in, which is the 95% case, and this case where you're trying to tip the economics by making it less profitable for the bad guys and more risk. Okay, so let's move on.
But some of those covered, installed, and covered casinos are unlimited.
Yes?
Are those just, could be anything, or are there specific things?
There were specific exploits which actually have been patched.
Okay.
And so our practice is, once we learn about these, we patch them, but it's sort of an ongoing effort.
There'll be some other dotted lines that come
Yes. And we could actually enumerate each one of these and tell you which patch actually solved each one of these, for example. We could go to that granularity. Okay, so let me go back. In terms of setting a vision for phishing, we wrestled with what did this whole thing mean now that we understand the battlefield. And we thought about, well, maybe it's something nice high level like tell the good guys from the bad guys. Or maybe it's stop identity theft. But even when you think that way, identity theft really is just a means to an end. You steal the identity in order to perpetrate fraud. So we hit upon this particular vision, which is our current working vision, an eternal one, might I add, that Windows customers are safe from electronic fraud while using the Internet. Now, vision, as we define it at Microsoft, is an end state of being. This is where you want to end up. If you did all this work over a number of years, putting in all this effort, what would you like to see happen? We want this to happen. We want people to be safe from fraud so they can do their electronic commerce while using the Internet. And we want to make sure that when you're using Windows, that happens. If it happens under Linux and other things, that's fine. But our focus is to make sure that it does work for Windows. Just thought I'd make that clear. So with respect to strategy, we talked earlier about strategies that pivoted around customer education, industry cooperation, technology, enforcement, and legislation. And you know what? Those are interesting buckets to put things in because those are different groups of people that typically author that stuff. But another way to think about it is, well, if you went with those buckets, maybe you're going to leave something out in your strategy because maybe this is a sixth bucket. So we said, how can we make sure we're going to cover the space? And we said, why don't we look at the attack itself? Let's look at what happens before an attack, what happens during an attack, and what can happen after an attack to make sure we have investments in every one of those domains, to make sure we're not leaving anything exposed. So, before an attack, we have this concept of reducing the attack volume, which is these choke points for spam, and there's quite a few possible things we can do there. There's reducing those covert attacks, which are all those dotted lines and those vulnerabilities. There's reducing the impact of an attack. So, for example, a lot of people use the same passwords for multiple accounts at multiple banks. That's just human nature because they're too hard to remember. You can limit the impact of such a thing by doing things like password hashing or even this low-tech solution that some banks have, which is scratch-off pins that only work for a single session. So if someone steals something, it's only good for that session, and unless you're a man-in-the-middle attack, it ain't going to help you very much. So this reduces the impact of a breach if you do get your stuff stolen. So this is important, something you do as a proactive thing. There's protecting your critical URLs. We talked about this earlier about, how do you deal with someone just dealing with Microsoft with misspelled by one. We actually have this strategy that is a domain defense where we actually go out and reserve URLs that are similar to ours to prevent people from potentially using them for phishing. We also evict cyber squatters. And then we also do trolling the web. We actually have web crawlers that look for trademark infringement by looking for some of our language and some of our logos on those sites to see if they're actually spoofed. Using this method, we've already shut down over 500 sites since February that were in this category. My favorite is ensuring visual integrity. I actually have a computer graphics background, and so I always think about how these displays actually work down to the hardware pixel level. And it really scares the pants off me that you can't tell the provenance of a pixel. I mean, at the end of the day, can you trust what you see on the screen? And we've seen exploits in the past where people would cover up the address bar or the status bar of IE, spoofing it. Well, if you could do that for just IE, you could probably do it in other places of the system as well. And I think this is one of those big architectural opportunities of going in and looking end-to-end at all our APIs and our drawing policies and looking at the hardware display system, subsystem, and actually ensuring that you understand how pixels get drawn. Because if you can't do that, I don't care what you see on the screen. Someone could write a driver that's spoofed that then draws funny things on the screen when you think it's drawing something else or covers up certain Windows error messages. I could easily write something like that if I wanted to, I would think. And the last one is the consumer education piece, the increased user awareness. So giving people a lot of tips and techniques to avoid being tricked by phishing all before the attack happens. Now, when the attack happens, you'd like to be able to make it really easy to validate, the email you get or the site you're on. And at the end of the day, it's a question of, is this site for real? How do I know this is really the site that I want to be at? And that's what this really tries to get at. And then this other one, just is the thing that makes me nervous. I always wonder, am I being watched right now? Do I have a keystroke logger on my machine right now? Have I been compromised? Can my machine tell me about kind of unrecognized traffic, about certain funny behavior, abnormal behavior that might indicate I've been compromised because some signature hasn't been released yet by a virus company? Maybe my system's smart enough to watch the ports and do a reverse firewall or something like that. I mean, I'd like to see stuff like that as a way to know an attack's right now happening. Now, after the attack happens, the first thing is let's do great forensics. I mean, you're going to need good data for that. So let's make it really easy to report both in the email, a single button, report this as a potential suspicious site or email in the browser. We need to unify how we collect and analyze this data within Microsoft. I know I have my little cache of a little zoo of phishing. Some other people do also. We really need to have a single place in the company where this stuff comes in. There's our interfaces to the government sites where things are reported. There's identifying ways to prevent and avoid, which is sort of like how do you actually change the system, and going back to this whole looping now to the before the attack. And then creating deterrence through enforcement. And this has all sorts of ideas here, which include sting operations and things like that, and coordinated efforts with the various agencies. So I actually handed out this table. And we're not going to go into it in any detail, but in my travels of surveying what was being thought about, I actually counted, I think, 45 different tactics that could be used across these 13 strategies. And so I laid them out in the before, during, and after topology just to kind of see the coverage, to see where things were. And this doesn't suggest when they're coming out or their efficacy, but it does at least is sort of a quick survey of the breadth of the kind of stuff we're talking about. And in the course of engaging you as an organization, if you have ideas about tactics that are possible, that might be interesting, I'd like to hear about them. If you have suggestions, that feedback loop, we should leverage it. Yeah.
At first glance, I don't see anything here about NASCAR or anything like that. Is that because it's not useful?
Well, for example, when you're trying to harden the keyboard, you might need to go all the way down to an NSCUB-like solution. Likewise for the display system. So I'm not adverse to eventually ending up there as a solution, but we should first think about it as why did we need to go there? Because, well, there's keyboard path hardening the system, keyboard path. I didn't list NSCUB explicitly, no. But it was in my mind when I thought about it. Well, if you have a keystroke logger, how's it working? Well, it's attaching itself to the keyboard input stream. Well, why is that possible? Why didn't I get notified? Can anybody do that? I mean, why? That seems kind of like a really important thing to know. And yet my system allowed it without any notification. That seems a little weird to me.
So in the past, we used to have this concept of trusted paths.
Yes.
That enable, for example, an user device on the keyboard to software piece of the system that was in some sense authentic. Yet I haven't heard you mentioning something equivalent or something similar as being a technical solution. In particular, you suggested earlier that in order to remove deceptive software, you have this additional add-on manager.
Yes.
How do I know that the add-on manager that displayed is the one provided by Microsoft or by the guy who installed the deceptive software?
System software has this whole signature-based properties to it. Now, I'm not an expert on how you assert the trust end-to-end and whether you need a further trusted path beyond what's already there. My gut feeling is that we do need to go further than we already have, and that we may end up at an NSCUB-like solution. I've built secure systems in the past where we pulled the flash off the motherboard in order to make it more secure and to actually add a hardware core for trustworthiness, which you then built outwards from, and you did runtime code checks to see if things were self-modifying themselves. So, I mean, you could go pretty extreme with respect to asserting the trustworthiness of a code path. And we may need to go there.
But you haven't figured out how far you want to go.
No, I think at this point we're just surveying the high-level tactics and then drilling down how would you implement it to make it happen. Yes, Peter.
This is a general question, a sort of comment for both sessions, for deception and for this. I have a feeling around the room lots of people have pet things, ideas that have come up today that we haven't had time to go through. And it may well be that a threat that we all see, or all of us writing our 3 to 5 different bullet points, or something, will get a lot of ideas from the collective expertise here. I mean, right now, CERT and other people don't have a phishing site for everyone to go to. Maybe that's something that should be created. Probably other people here have long lists. As a process point, I suspect if you ask people here to start writing those things up and send them in after the meeting, there'll be a lot of ideas generated.
Yes, I'm hoping that we will do that. And maybe, David, you could help coordinate that in whatever way makes sense. Let me drill down through this so we can get through the last couple of slides. So right now, the tactics that are in play that are actually either have been released or will be released, there's the smart screen technology, which is today blocking 2.7 billion messages a day for spam. That's a lot of messages being blocked. There's online consumer education in the www.microsoft/phishing and spyware sites, which is in the links at your reference material. We do this proactive detection of spoof sites. I mentioned we shut down 500 of them. There's the follow the money enforcement that's ongoing. There's a cleaner for the download.check specific keystroke logger. This is not a scalable solution per se, but it does address specific ones we know about in variants. We obviously have fixes for the known vulnerabilities that have been rolling out on a more continually basis. And even the banks have this low-tech scratch-off pin solution I mentioned. They actually have been deploying it.
Is this smart screen technology already available?
Yes, it's in use. It's in the field. And Bill Gates recently sent out an executive email that you can look at that talks a little bit about it. There's also a site, I think, that talks about it as well. So other tactics that are just about to be released, obviously everyone knows about XPSP2, and I mentioned some of the mitigations. There's a fishnet, this is all confidential by the way, sting operation being launched in August. This is with the Secret Service, the FBI, the mail service, financial institutions like Citigroup, et cetera. We helped kick this off. And they're planning to go after these guys and set up honeypots or whatever their strategies are. There's other ongoing education efforts like Project Protect, possibly in the fall. And there's this other technology called Sender ID, which is sort of this merge of the original caller ID proposal with SPF, if you're familiar with any of these technologies, which help assert where this email is coming from. And this is going to help a lot when it's actually rolled out. So if you look at this now on the battlefield, you can kind of see the amount of coverage we have. So down over here, we've got Sender ID and Smart Screen as part of creating the choke point. We've got consumer education, so people can kind of tell that emails are spoofed. And this whole box here basically blows out what we're doing for email in the browser with respect to education and reporting. We've hardened IE, OE, and Outlook in terms of the known vulnerabilities. There is also a new drawing policy in the browser that prevents the paint over of the address bar and the status bar, which is this box right here. There's additional consumer education with respect to viewing the website. There's also consumer education for how to report, which is through the FBI or FTC sites. In XBSP2, we mentioned that there's blocking pop-ups and downloads, which stops this box, or at least reduces it. And leaving your front door open, there's a new mitigation there as well. For the keystroke loggers, there's the Microsoft cleaners that have been released for that specific one. In the back end, there's the follow the money strategy and the sting operations, and the banks are using scratch-off pins. With respect to this spoof site that you see or it tries to launch, there's the proactive detection, aggressive shutdown, and domain defense that I mentioned that is being deployed as we speak. The 400 or 500 sites that have been shut down. So that's what it looks like today. And you'll notice it's not really great coverage. I mean, it's not bad, but it's still sparse. So let's talk about other things. Other tactics in the queue are safe and block lists. And the first deployment would probably be to Smart Screen because, again, you want to get as far upstream as you can to the stuff that's coming in. And the biggest volume is in the email. So being able to block emails based on the embedded URL that's inside it is better than doing it at the browser level. Although you still want to do it at the browser level. And adding a report button to report email fraud in Hotmail. Other tactics that are on the books that we're looking at, making no commitments here. There's adding the safe and block list to the browser, reporting bad sites that the browser sees. There's also been some observation that it's largely unregistered websites, domains that are in use. So the form of the address that's number, whatever, is often a tip-off that it's to an unregistered domain. And if we could somehow block on this type of thing, we might be able to stop more of this kind of software from coming in, or at least create a consent experience. There's adding computational challenges to also fight spam. I think you've heard about stuff like this, where you have to visually report back and have a dialogue. There's actively detecting and blocking zombies. I mean, if you can actually get the bot farms not be as effective because they're being blocked, their zombies are being blocked, you could tell that you have abnormal behavior in the system itself, self-monitors, then that could help as well. Nobody wants their own machine to be a zombie. So this is very valuable to have in my, if I would like my machine to be doing this. Blocking keystroke loggers, actually watching the traffic on the back end. We talked about that. Looking at all the attachment points for like BHOs and having consent experiences. Adding password hashing, which again just means that you're squirreling the passwords depending on the domain you're going to. And increasing the visual integrity of the system as a general initiative. So if we look at how this looks, it looks a little better. So, we've added some of these things here in terms of computational challenges and the URL filtering. We've got various things here in the back end, which include the URL safe block list, which is this last little bit before the user enters their data. We still need some way of knowing, is this site for real when you're actually on a pop-up that's kind of a special case. There's still really no great way to block piggybacking. I mean, to actually know up front what something's doing is more a sandboxing exercise. And declarative, tell me what kind of services you need kind of thing, and maybe from there you could figure it out. In the back end, we mentioned password hashing already. So this kind of gives you a feel. Now, the value of looking at a picture like this says that, okay, there's so many things we can do. Which do we do? Well, you can think about it with respect to the harms. And we know that users are harmed, and there's a lot of money flowing out. We know that the financial people are being harmed. And we know that Microsoft is being harmed reputationally. And different parts of the picture will read on those different harms. So depending on which harms you're trying to mitigate, you might take different paths for this picture. Likewise, the volume is also something that needs to be taken into account. So, for example, it makes no sense to work on something that's on a fringe that has very little volume and really doesn't affect any of the harms directly. But what's interesting is the harms that affect Microsoft the most reputationally are in the areas of vulnerabilities. People start to think that our system isn't secure, blah, blah, blah. The other harms are clearly to the financials because they just can't sustain the hit to the confidence in e-commerce. And the harms to consumers is across the board. So, next steps. Basically establish an end-to-end plan that provides the best coverage over time for the worst harms. Right? So taking all those elements and doing it in time space to kind of figure out, okay, what can we do now, short term, long term, and what order should we do them in, and how can we get them to have the most impact to these harms is really what we're after. So we're leveraging our resources to the maximum. Next steps would be assess the current status of the current and proposed tactics, and make sure we understand where they are somebody already delivering them? What's their vehicles? We've got to look at all that information, identify holes and improvements, ratify a plan, and go, go, go. So this would be sort of the added layer on top of the independent efforts people are doing. This puts it all under, more or less a single roof where you can get more efficacy out of the efforts. So now that we're left with 30 seconds for questions. Yes?
What is the sender ID? I thought that was one of the big unsolved problems of Internet architecture.
So I'm not an expert on sender ID, but from what I understand, it has something to do with the DNS records and being able to know where something came from. It's extra information that's included that allows you to assert the authenticity of who this is, where it's coming from, and it's at a domain level. It's not a particular addressee, but it's the domain they come from.
You can take it at your machine, but eventually it's going to get denied. If you have corrupted that, you just trace that, you can trace it back to that. It's kind of like tracing a letter, tracing the postage stamp back to the post office from your house.
Yeah, so you should look at www.microsoft.com/sender-ID, and I think there's actually a white paper. Yes?
I think it's great that you're doing this. I saw a presentation from the Gartner Group, and I think they surveyed users 1 year ago, I think this year, and I think, how many of you were worried about findings of the Internet? It was often, not on the horizon, 5%. And then 1 year later, it was 35%. So I have the feeling that this is potentially jeopardizing the whole thing.
You got it. That's why we're worried about it.
I think the unit is months.
Yeah.
I think it's plausible to my non-technical friends who don't buy things now. They're not going to start buying things. And I think I could imagine in 12 months this being pretty different.
There's a great article actually just got this morning in the reports, which kind of very detailed set analysis on awareness and the impact of antivirus spam. That's the software and go to the next products. It's a very good article.
Yeah, I mean, I really think I can imagine the general populace, just like the .com bust, just say, although I can get new deals sometimes this way, it's just not really the capital about
So we've got the FTC reporting that 1 in 7 Americans victims of some form of identity theft. 1 in 10 have been victims of some form of phishing. All right, Chief. I'm sorry.
1 in 10 have been solicited for phishing, 1 in 10 fallen for phishing.
Not clear.
And where does it become identity? That there's just no misuse of one's credit card number?
Well, but the statute gets into, it's a little bit of a broad definition because it essentially includes even sort of basic credit card fraud. There's various.
We learned to deal with it.
Well,
Because we have to integrate liability.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I think that's perhaps for me the most troubling thing about here, to the extent, I don't know what the breakdown is between credit card fraud and bank fraud.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Bank fraud is a real problem.
Yeah, that's why it's on top.
I mean, yeah, and what is the breakdown? And certainly, I mean, if the banks really care about this, we need some liability protection.
Yep. So we're out of time, and I just want to thank you for your attention. I will be around now during the break, and I will also be at the dinner, so please tackle me, and I can't wait to get your feedback and hear more about your ideas. Thank you.